Today I'm going to be reading the third part of Chapter 5 of Hiroshima by John Hersey. Father Wilhelm Cleansword. Back in the hospital in Tokyo for the second time, Father Cleansword was suffering from fever, diarrhea, wounds that would not heal, wildly fluctuating blood counts, and utter exhaustion. For the rest of his life, his was to be a classic case history of the vague, borderline form of an A-bomb sickness in which a person's body developed a rich repertory of symptoms, few of which could be positively attributed to radiation, but many of which turned up in Habusaki in various combinations and degrees, so often as to be blamed by some doctors and almost all patients on the bomb. Father Cleansword lived in the life of a misery and most extraordinarily selfless spirit. After his discharge from the hospital, he returned to the Nubermachi chapel he had helped build, and there he continued his self-effacing pastoral life. In 1948, he was named priest of a much grander Messina church in another part of town. There were not yet many tall buildings in the city, and the neighbors called the big church the Messiah Palace. A convent of helpers of holy souls was attached to the church. And besides his priestly duties of conducting Mass, hearing confessions, and teaching the Bible classes, he ran 8-day retreats for novices and sisters of the convent, during which the woman, given communion and instructed by from day to day, would maintain silence. He still visited Suzuki-san and other Habusakan who were still sick and wounded, and he yet even babysat for young mothers. He often went to the sanatorium at Saiho, an hour by train from the city, to convert tuberculin patients. Father Kleinswerd was briefly hospitalized in Tokyo twice more. His German Jesuit colleagues were of opinion in all his work he was little too much. Concerned for others and not enough for himself, beyond his own stubborn sense of mission, he had taken on himself the Japanese spirit of Enro, setting the self apart, putting the wishes of others first. They thought he might literally kill himself with kindness to others. He was too ruscular. They were too regardful when gifts of delicacies came from relatives in Germany. He gave them all away. When he gave penicillin from another occupational doctor, he gave it to the parishioners who were as sick as he. Among his other complaints, he had syphilis, which he had apparently caught from transfusions in one of the hospital stays. It was cured eventually. He gave lessons on catechism when he had a high fever. After he came back from a long hike of pastoral calls, the Messiah housekeeper would see him collapse on steps of his rectory. Head down, a figure it seemed to of utter defeat. The next day he would be out in the streets again. Gradually, over years of his unremitting labor, he gathered his modest harvest, some 400 baptisms, some 40 marriages. Father Cleansword loved the Japanese and their ways. One of his German colleagues, Father Benzkorn, jokingly said that Father Cleansword was married to Japan shortly after he moved to the Messiah Church. He read that a new law of naturalization had been passed by a diet, with these requirements that one live in Japan for at least 5 years, be over 20 years old, and mentally sound, be good of character, be able to support oneself, and be able to accept single nationality. He hastened to submit proofs that he met all these, and after some months of review, he was accepted. He registered himself as a Japanese citizen after the name he would henceforth bear, Father Moto Takamura. For a few months in the spring and summer of 1956, his poor health declined still further. Father Takamura filled a temporary vacancy in a small parish in the Norberachen district. 5 years before the reverend of Mr. Kashu Tanimoto, whom Father Takamura went well, had begun giving Bible classes to a group of girls whose faces had been disfigured by keloids. Later, some of them had been taken as so-called Hiroshima maidens to the United States for plastic surgery. One of them, Tokomoki Nababashiki, whom Father Takamura had converted and baptized, died on an operating table at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Her ashes were carried to her family when the first group of the maidens returned to Hiroshima that summer of 1956, and it fell to Dr. Takamura to preside at her funeral. During it, he nearly fainted. At Noramachi, he began instructing the female members, a mother and two daughters, of wealthy and cultural family named Nagasaki. Feverish or not, he went to them, always on foot, every evening. Sometimes he would arrive early. He would pace up and down the street outside, then ring the bell at precisely 7 o'clock. He would look at himself in the hall mirror, adjust his hair and habit, and enter the living room. He would teach for an hour. Then the Nagasaki would serve tea and sweets, and they would chat until exactly 10. He felt at home in that house. The younger daughter, Hakushiku, became devoted to him, and when, after 18 months, the various symptoms grew so bad that he was going to have to be hospitalized, she asked him to baptize her, and he did, on the day before he entered the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital for an entire year's stay. His most disturbing complaint was a weird infection in his fingers, which he had been bloated with pus and would not heal. He had a fever and flu-like symptoms. His white blood count was seriously low, and he had pain in his knees, particularly in the left one, and in the other joints. His fingers were operated on and slowly healed. He was treated for leukopenia before his discharge, and Occam Matthias found he had the beginnings of a bomb cataract. He returned to the large Messiah congregation, but it was harder and harder for him to carry the kind of overload he cherished. He developed back pain, which was caused, doctors said, by a kidney stone. He passed it, dragged down by constant pain and by infections that were abated by a storage of white cells. He limped through his days, pushing himself beyond his strength. Finally, in 1961, he was mercifully put out to pasture by a disease in a tiny diocese in a tiny church in the country town of Makarora, the town where Dr. Sasaki was flooring in his private clinic. The compound of the Makuhara Church, at the crest of a steep rise from the town, enclosed a small chapel with an oaken table for an altar and a space for a flock about 20 to kneel. Japanese fashion, on a spread of takumara matting, in an uphill, a cramped parsonage, Father Takamura chose his bedroom in a parsonage, a room of no more than 6 feet square, as bare as a monk's cell. He ate in another such cell next to it, and the kitchen and bathroom beyond were dark, chilly, sunken rooms no larger than others. Across a narrow corridor running the length of the building were an office and much larger bedroom, which Father Takamura, true to his nature, reserved for guests. When he first arrived, he felt enterprising on the principle the souls are best caught while unripe. He had builders add 2 rooms to the chapel and started in them what he called to be St. Mary's kindergarten. So he began a bleak life for 4 Catholics, the priest, 2 Japanese sisters to teach the babies, and a Japanese woman to cook. Few believers came to the church. His parish consisted of 4 previously converted families, about 10 worshippers in all. Some Sundays, no one showed up for Mass. After its first spurt, Father Takamura's energy rapidly flagged. Once each week, he took a train to Hiroshima and went to the Red Cross Hospital for a checkup. At Hiroshima Station, he picked up what he loved best to read as he traveled: timetables with schedules of trains going all over Honshu Island. The doctors injected steroids in his painful joints and treated him for chronic flu-like symptoms. And once he reported he had found traces of blood in his underwear, which the doctors guessed came from the new kidney stones. In the village of Makuhara, he tried to be as inconspicuous as Japanese as he could. He sometimes wore Japanese clothes, not wanting to seem high living, and he never bought meat in the local market, but sometimes he smuggled some out from the city. A Japanese priest who occasionally came to see him, Father Hakusawa, admired his efforts to carry his naturalization through to perfection, but found him in many ways unshakable German. He had a tendency when he was rebuffed in an undertaking to stubbornly push all the harder straight for it, whereas Japanese would more chastely look for some way around. Father Hageshiya noticed that when Father Takamura was hospitalized, he rigidly respected the hospital's visiting hours, and if people came, even from far away, to see him outside proper hours, he refused to receive them. Once eating with his friend, Father Hakushiya declined his host's offer of a bowl of rice. He said he was full, but then delicious pickles appeared, which caused the Japanese palate to cry out for rice, and he decided to have a bowl after all. Father Takamura was outraged. In his guest's view, German, he could he how could he eat rice plus a pickle when he had been too full to eat rice alone? During this period, Father Takamura was one of many people whom Dr. Robert J. Lifton interviewed in preparing to write his book, Death in Life: Survivors of Hiroshima. In one conversation, the priest hinted that he realized that the achieved of true identity as a Habusakan than Japanese. If a person says to me that he is weary, if it is a Habusakan who says it gives me different feeling than if he is an ordinary person, he doesn't have to explain. He knows all uneasiness, all temptation to lose spirit and be depressed, and then starting again to see if he can do his job. If a Japanese hears the words Tanu Beacon, His Majesty the Emperor, it is a different from Westerner hearing them. A very different feeling in the foreign heart from what is felt in the Japanese person's heart. It is a simpler question in the case of who is the victim and one who is not. Then they hear about another victim. I met a man one time who said, I experienced the atomic bomb, and from then the conversation, we both understood each other's feelings. Nothing had to be said. In 1966, Father Takamura had to change cooks. A woman named Sasu Yoshima, who was 35 years old, recently cured of tuberculosis, had recently baptized, had been told to report for an interview at the Makuharan church. Having been given the Japanese name of the priest, she was astonished to be greeted by a big gaijin, a foreigner dressed in a quilted Japanese gown. His face, which was rounded out and puffy, doubtless of medication, struck her, as of a baby. At once, indeed, were commenced a true relationship, soon to blossom into one complete mutual trust, in which her role seemed to be ambiguous, part daughter, part mother. His growing helplessness kept her subjugation. She tenderly nursed him. Her cooking was primitive, her temper cranky. He said he would eat anything, even Japanese noodles, but he was sharp with her about his food, as he could never been with anyone else. Once, once he spoke of strained baked potatoes his real mother had cooked. She tried to make them, he said. These are not like my mother's. He loved fried prawns and ate them with when he went to Hiroshima for checkups. She tried to cook them, he said. These are burned. She stood up beside him in the tiny eating room, her hands behind her gripping the door jamb so tightly that in a time its paint was all worn away. Yet he praised her confidently in her, joked with her, apologized to her. Catch time, he lost his temper. She thought him, under the shortness which she had attributed to pain, gently pure, patient, sweet, humorous, and deeply kind. Once on a late spring day, not long after Yakushu-san arrived, sparrows alighted in the persimmon tree outside his office window. He clapped his hands to drive them away, and soon there appeared o'er his palms purple spots of sort of all Habusakin dreaded. The doctors, they were. They seemed to be blood bruises, but his blood test did not suggest leukemia. He had sought hemorages in his urinary tract. What if I get blood in my brains? He asked once. His joints still hurt. He developed liver dysfunction. high blood pressure, back pains, chest pains, an electric cardiogram turned up an anomaly. He was put on a drug to ward off coronary attack, an operating drug. He was given steroids, hormones, and a biotic drug. I don't take medicines, I eat them, he said, Yoko Shaki-san. In 1971, he was hospitalized for an operation to see whether his liver was cancerous. It was not. All through the time of his decline, a stream of visitors came to see him, thanking him for all he had done for them in the past. Hashiko Nakashiya, the woman had baptized him the day before his long hospitalization, was especially faithful. She brought him open-faced sandwiches on German rye bread, which he loved. And when Yokoshika needed a vacation, she would move in tend him in her absence. Father Bikafora would come for a few days at a time. They would talk and drink a great deal again, which Father Takamura had also come to love. One winter day at the beginning of 1976, Father Takamura slipped and fell on a steep icy path down the town. The next morning, Yakushika-san heard him shouting her name. She found him in the bathroom, leaning over the washstand, unable to move. With all of his strength and her love, she carried him. He weighed about 175 pounds to his bed, and he laid down for a month, and he was unable to move. She improvised a bedpan, and she cared for him day and night. Finally, she borrowed a wheelchair from the town's office and took him to Dr. Sasaki's clinic. The two men had known each other years before, but now one living in his monk's cell and the other in his grand apartment in the four-story clinic. They were light years apart. Dr. Sasaki took an x-ray, saw nothing, diagnosed nuclearia, and advised message. Father Takamura could not abide an idea of usual female messenger. A man was hired. During the workout, Father Takamura held Yoshika-san's hand and his face reddened. The pain was unbearable. Yoshika-san hired a car and drove Father Takamura to a city, to the Red Cross Hospital. An x-ray on a bigger machine showed fractures of the 11th and 12th thoracic vertebrae. He was operating on relief pressure on the right sciatic nerve, and he was fitted with a corset. From then on, he was bedridden. Yokoshika-san fed him, changed diapers that she made for him, and cleaned his body. He read the Bible and timables, the only two sort of texts. He told Yokoshika-san that never told lies. He could tell you what train to take, the price of food in the dining car, and how to change trays at such and such a station to save 300 yen. One day, he called Yokoshika-san, greatly excited. He had found an error. Only the Bible told the truth. His fellow priests finally persuaded him to go to St. Luke's Hospital in Kobe. Yokoshika-san visited him, and he drew out a book, a copy of his chart on which he was written, a living corpse. He said that he wanted to go home with her, and she took him. Because of you, my soul has been able to get through purgatory. He said to her when he was in his own bed. He weakened, and his two fellow priests moved him to a two-room house in a hollow just below their novitiate in Nagasaki. Yakusake-san told she wanted to sleep in his room with him. No, he said. His vows would not permit that. She lied, saying the Father Superior had ordered it. Greatly relieved, he allowed it. After that night, he seldom opened his eyes. She fed him only ice cream. When visitors came, all he could say was, "Thank you." He fell into coma on November 1999, with a doctor, a priest, and Yokoshaki-san at his side. This explosion-affected person took a deep breath and died. He was buried in a serene pine grove at the top of a hill above the novitiate. Father Wilhelm M. Takamura, S.J., rest in peace. The fathers and brothers of Nagasaki Novitiate noticed over the years that there was almost always fresh flowers at his grave. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.